The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have even more controversy now from Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos. We've tracked over the last couple of months how the literal religious rightists have been outraged at Neil deGrasse Tyson's analyses of the age of the universe, of what else? Evolution, of so many different scientific concepts. The religious right is very angry that their literal biblical views, of course, just arbitrarily one set of religious beliefs, has not been presented equally on Cosmos, or even really given much credence at all. We are now getting, I don't know if I would call this the pièce de résistance or where we're actually getting on this, Lewis, but climate change is now the topic. And Neil deGrasse Tyson made a very, very astute analogy when it came to weather versus climate, because we often hear from the right, the climate change deniers in particular, they will say, hold on a second. Humans are terrible at predicting day-to-day weather. And you expect us to believe scientists when they tell us they know what's going on with the climate long term? That doesn't make any sense. And Neil deGrasse Tyson tackled that head on in the latest episode of Cosmos. Check this out.
Okay, so if we scientists are so good at making these dire long-term predictions about the climate, how come we're so lousy about predicting the weather? Besides, this year, we had a colder winter in my town. For all the scientists know, we could be in for global cooling. Here's the difference between weather and climate. Weather is what the atmosphere does in the short term, hour to hour, day to day. Weather is chaotic, which means that even a microscopic disturbance can lead to large-scale changes. That's why those 10-day weather forecasts are useless. A butterfly flaps its wings in Bali, and 6 weeks later, your outdoor wedding in Maine is ruined. Climate is the long-term average of the weather over a number of years. It's shaped by global forces that alter the energy balance in the atmosphere, such as changes in the sun, tilt of the Earth's axis, the amount of sunlight the Earth reflects back to space, and the concentration of greenhouse gases in the air. A change in any of them affects the climate in ways that are broadly predictable. My friend's meandering represents the short-term fluctuations. That's weather. It's almost impossible to predict what will attract his interest next. But not hard to know what the range of his meandering will be, because I'm holding him on a leash. We can't observe climate directly. All we see is the weather. The average weather over the course of years reveals a pattern.
This is a brilliant explanation. And really the concept is, if you're walking a dog from point A to point B, and you observe this from far away, you may not be able to predict when the dog is going to stop and smell something. Is the dog going to go to the bathroom in the middle of the walk? Is the dog zigging and zagging left to right? But generally speaking, you can chart the general direction of that walk from A to B. And sometimes, Lewis, you have to almost become so simplistic to even open the door to a rational conversation with those who want to shield their eyes from facts. But if it accomplishes that, then the simplicity of it, I think, should be applauded.
Right, and it's easy because you're not really trying to explain scientific theory and studies to people when you're talking about it this way. You simply say, you're talking about the weather, I'm talking about the climate, and one is far more erratic and hard to predict.
We talked last week about this selective acceptance of the liberal Enlightenment movement, particularly when it comes to science. If it doesn't conflict with your religious views, then we're okay with it, except when it does, then we question the entire system. And it's humorous, to say the least, humorous, ironic, troubling, that the vast majority of those who deny global warming do so in part because they say, the science is not 100% in agreement about what's going on. Yet this is the exact same group that often is motivated by religious teachings, which have far less than a 97-3 consensus that they are literally believable. And it almost has caused this distortion of the terms, right? We've talked about the term theory, and we've created a distinction between the scientific definition of a theory and the colloquial definition of a theory, which is more an idea or a hypothesis. But there's another one now that we have to look at, which is that of consensus. If we think of the term consensus the way the climate deniers seem to interpret it, it basically means, well, it's one of many opinions that have an equal shot of just not being right, when in reality what we mean is the scientific consensus, right? Which is the collective judgment of those in the scientific community that have explored this topic via the scientific method. It's a drastically different definition of consensus, and the words actually seem to be a lot of what the deniers are relying on here.
Well, right. We talk about a lot of things in which just the words, to quote Michael Richards,
Yeah.
Are the most important thing. It's manipulation of words, it's the changing of words, and it's people using them incorrectly. And I guess it's disastrous in reality.
The reality is we have to live with the fact that Neil deGrasse Tyson's explanation, his analogy on Cosmos about climate change and weather, will do nothing for those who choose to subjugate science in order to then choose faith-based belief, right? The obstacles that they are putting up are not born through a cogent argument. They are born through a lack of willingness to accept alternatives in many cases, and we just have to deal with that. Now, if we talk about explanations for why climate change isn't a problem, we've heard a lot. We've heard discussions about carbon. We've heard discussions about CO2. We've heard discussions about temperature and weather and cold winters. We have never heard it explained, to my knowledge so far, as the imminent return of Jesus is what's causing erratic weather. Matthew Hagee kicked off his latest Hagee Hotline by telling viewers that this is a situation, climate change, that is not really climate change. It is just the imminent return of Jesus that is causing the bizarre weather. Now, before we get to the clip, I'll remind you, Matthew Hagee is the son of John Hagee, another pastor. John Hagee said that the crisis in Ukraine was the beginning of the last days, that rock music is satanic cyanide that should be taken outside and burned. John Hagee also told atheists to leave the country because they aren't wanted and will not be missed. Not falling too far from the tree, his son Matthew Hagee has said that the Navy Yard shooting was a sign of Jesus' imminent return. That the Defense of Marriage Act ruling from the Supreme Court was a sign that the rapture was about to occur, and also that healing in Jesus' name works every single time. If the person dies, it's because the healing in Jesus' name was just not done correctly. Here is Matthew Hagee's view on the imminent return of Jesus as the explanation for erratic weather patterns.
The reason that I bring this up is because every day we pick up headlines that give reasons for situations in our world, and many times those situations have nothing to do with the report. For example, we hear that all of the weather events that are taking place in the world today are a result of environmental impact of global warming, that emissions from factories and sorts of things are the reason why there's mudslides and the reason why there's hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and all of these various situations. That's incorrect. The Bible says that whenever we approach the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, that there would be strange weather patterns. Jesus said this in Matthew, the 25th chapter. So we have a decision to make. Do we believe what an environmentalist group says and choose to live in a world where we're attempting to make everything as clean in the air as possible? Or do we believe what the Bible says, that these things were going to happen, and that rather than try and clean up all of the air and solve all the problems of the world by eliminating factories, we should start to tell people about Jesus Christ, who is to return?
This is the best commentary around climate change yet. It's not a denial of the observable facts. It's just coming up with this completely unfalsifiable theory, and I use the term theory colloquially here. I really mean harebrained idea about why we see erratic weather. It's brilliant, Lewis, in the sense that it completely makes obsolete any scientific analysis if you choose to simply have faith in this idea.
Right. It's also brilliant because it's exactly what the people listening to him want to hear.
Right.
He knows that, and it keeps them listening. He is truly a master at manipulating his sheeple, as they're called.
His rhetorical question about what do we believe here is essentially, do we believe science, Or do we believe the distorted, translated stories attributed to a deity with absolutely no evidence for such attribution? That's essentially the question that he's asking. And I'm actually conflicted, Lewis, because if I recall correctly, I thought the weather patterns were a punishment for it was either too many gay people, too many abortions, or not enough prayer in school. So it's really, truly shocking that one unfalsifiable, fact-free hypothesis is in direct conflict with another.
You're right. It really doesn't make sense. You also just got me thinking, I wonder how many tornadoes are a direct result of exporting so many jobs to China.
Right, that's true. Hey, yeah. Why is it that so many of the other things that really are terrible in this country seem to not bring on the wrath of God? That's if you believe in a vindictive God, if you believe in an angry, evil, vengeful God, why do so many of the truly horrible things that the United States does not ever get mentioned as the impetus for the bizarre weather and tornadoes? I don't know. A toddler is in a coma after police tossed a grenade into his crib during a drug raid. Now, the war on drugs leads to many, many bad things. We've talked about them. It fuels the prison industrial complex in a terrifying, vicious cycle. It destroys families over arbitrarily illegal drugs. It adds to gun violence. It disproportionately imprisons minority and nonviolent offenders. It costs a lot of money. It's really not fiscally conservative. It lines the pockets of private prisons. It does a lot of things. That's the macro rather. At the micro, though, it also leads to just horrible situations like this, where Alicia Fonasavan told WSB-TV she was staying with her sister-in-law in Habersham County after her family's home burned down when a SWAT team burst into the home as part of a drug investigation. One of the officers tossed a grenade that caused burns, cuts, and other injuries to her 19-month-old son, who then had to be put into a medically induced coma after the grenade landed in his playpen and exploded right in his face on his pillow. The boy has been taken to a burn unit. Police did seize drugs at the home earlier, and then they returned with a no-knock warrant to arrest a man known to have drugs and weapons. Now, I got one email saying, hey, you know what? They were kind of creating, they had barricaded themselves. There was something up against the door that was preventing the door from being opened. And then the libertarian counterpoint to that I've received via email is, well, people have a right to prevent forced entry into their home, right? Regardless of whether it's police or someone else, you can't really be held liable for simply preventing easy forced entry into your home. One is just protecting themselves. I don't know that I want to get too much into that specific issue, Lewis, but a toddler in a coma after a grenade explodes in a crib. I mean, just the violence of the language is just sickening here.
Right. They claim they had no idea that there was a toddler in the home. They say they would have done things differently if they knew that. I'm guessing this was a flashbang, something along those lines. But it's very unfortunate. I don't know. I'm not really sure about their protocol and what they could have done to scout things out before approaching the building.
I got some emails from people saying, hold on, the SWAT team, these are the best of the best. Didn't they see that the vehicle in the driveway had a car seat? I mean, are we not really dealing with the best of the best of the best who could have figured out one way or another that there might be a baby inside? Did they look through the windows before bursting in? I don't want to really prejudge the specifics because we really weren't there. What we know is that it is just a horrible, horrible story.
Right. And judging from a lot of the stories we've covered, I certainly wouldn't call SWAT teams the best of the best. I think that's usually reserved for certain groups of the military.
Let's talk a little bit about a story that's local from Massachusetts. I was in Massachusetts over the weekend, and when I was there, I picked up a local paper and saw a very strange story, which I found online and we'll link you to. And the story is about a man, a local man to Western Massachusetts, who admitted to trying to lure a 10-year-old girl to a secluded location for sex. The idea for 60-year-old Howard Goulet was he saw the girl outside of a courthouse and offered her money to go with him. And according to a prosecutor, the girl immediately told her mother, called the police. Police arrived, arrested Goulet, and he admitted straight up what I was doing was I was going to give the 10-year-old girl some beer so that she would let me kiss her and, quote, feel her up, according to the prosecutor. Goulet did plead guilty to accosting a person of the opposite sex and enticement of a child under 16. There will be a 6-month he's currently serving a 6-month sentence for a false fire alarm, and he is going to have a sentence of 2.5 years in jail. So, okay, kind of a run-of-the-mill story. Why do I want to talk about this? Here's why. According to the state sex offender registry, Goulet was already convicted of indecent assault and battery on a child under 14 in 1982. That's 32 years ago. Dissemination of harmful materials to minors in 1992. Open and gross lewdness and lascivious behavior in both 1992 and 1994, as well as indecent assault and battery on a person 14 or older in 2006. Lewis, we have a very difficult situation when it comes to incarceration in this country. The balance between rehabilitation, which happens quite rarely in our criminal justice system, and prevention of future crime, right? Which would deterrence by keeping someone in prison. But the local discussion about this is, why was this guy out anyway with this number of convictions related to lewdness and young children? Why was he even out in the first place? We don't know the details of every single one of those cases, but what should be done here? Is there any chance of true rehabilitation for such a habitual offender involving children in sexual situations?
I don't think so. Not in this man's case. I mean, perhaps if he were faced with longer sentences, maybe he would think twice before doing it again. But if he knows he's only going to be in jail for a couple of years, I don't think that there's any deterrent there. I think he should be in prison for life.
So then the question becomes, do we agree with mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws and the like? I know someone right now who has, because of being in the wrong place at the wrong time in another part of the country, was served 2 very short stints in prison. And because of the 3-strike law where they are, even though they've never been convicted of anything violent, it was always kind of drug-related, wrong place, wrong time type of crimes. If they are now arrested and convicted of anything, they're in prison for life. So that seems grossly unfair. And at the same time, we have a guy making his 5th offense here, his 5th conviction involving inappropriate behavior, often with children. I really don't know the answer.
In this, I think it's easy. Is it a little bit different when you have like an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old or something along those lines? Right. That's different. Should we have mandatory minimums for drugs? No. Should we have mandatory minimums for this? Maybe. I don't know.
All right, we'll take a break. Send me your thoughts on this. Plenty more coming up.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. When reality doesn't live up to right-wing ideals, there's only one possible explanation. Reality itself suffers from liberal bias. Find out more at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is Matthew Ditloff. Matthew, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. We couldn't do it without you. More on that later. You can support our program by using the Amazon banner on our website, davidpakman.com. If you're ever going to do any shopping on Amazon.com, click on that banner and then do your shopping. Even better, bookmark the link and then use it whenever you shop. That way you don't even have to come to our website. Some interesting items purchased through our Amazon link. A lot of different salts like sea salts, pink and blue salts. This seems to be all the rage now, Lewis, for cooking, using all of these exotic types of salts. I always just thought it was good to eat a low sodium diet, but a lot of these new salts now, I guess, have all sorts of cool flavors. I have never even thought of buying any of these salts since I use such little salt in cooking anyway. What do you think about this?
I mean, it sounds fine. I guess some dishes you're going to need to put some salt in, and you might as well use something good, high quality and interesting, right?
Yeah, I guess. But do we need salt to taste differently now? Is that the new thing? Are we at that point as a society?
I don't see the harm in salt to taste different, different flavors of salt. It seems fine.
All right. And also, a lot of the Dune, of course, the famous science fiction book by Frank Herbert, a lot of the sequels and prequels to Dune have been purchased on our Amazon portal lately. And I've read the book. I've seen the movie by the great David Lynch of Elephant Man and Mulholland Drive fame, but I have never read any of the prequels and sequels to Dune. Honestly, Lewis, sometimes when there are so many prequels and sequels, it's almost hard to figure out which to read, and I end up just reading the original book and saying that's it.
Nothing wrong with that. I can understand that sometimes being a bit overwhelming.
All right, thank you. Glad you approve of that, Lewis. Also, a quick note, for all of you who have mobile phones, iPhone or Android phones, we need more people to listen to our show on the Stitcher app. The app is free. You can get it on iPhone or Android. We need to get to 5,000 active listeners on the Stitcher platform. We have around 3,000 right now. Most people are using, iTunes directly or their computer or some other app, iHeartRadio, to listen to the show. But if we can get to 5,000 active listeners on Stitcher, Stitcher will actually start to monetize our Stitcher podcast, which would be great for our program. So everybody, please download the Stitcher application and subscribe or favorite, whatever they call the David Pakman Show on there. I've been getting a lot of emails lately about the failures in liberal media, and a lot of our audience is worried. We've seen Randy Rhoads, the longtime Progressive Talk radio host, go off the air. We've seen Ed Schultz quit his radio show, instead doing a 1-hour web show. And he said it was because he wanted more flexibility. I think it's pretty well understood that commercial radio show is not really doing that well. Stephanie Miller has spoken openly on her commercial radio show about the issues with funding right now for progressive media, particularly commercial progressive media. So people have been asking how we're weathering that storm. Yes, ad revenue, including like YouTube revenue, has decreased more than 40% per 1,000 views as it's measured. This is a really big deal. So I can say without any hesitation whatsoever, I want clarity this evening, Lewis, to channel Phil Davison. If it were not for the direct funding we get from our members, we would have been out of business 18 to 24 months ago. I mean, that's absolutely clear. And we're lucky, Lewis, that we don't depend on commercial ad revenue.
Right. That is important. I think this is kind of, I'm not necessarily sure that this is a result of the media that we're talking about being liberal or any type of,
no,
or the content. I mean, I think this is just the direction we're headed in. I mean, we took advantage of the internet, and I think we did that successfully. And I think that has a lot to do with our limited success.
Conservative ideas lend themselves to the commercial talk radio format for sure. But as Lewis says, there is a change in platforms that's going on. So I'll be totally upfront. If we didn't have the membership program, the show would have been gone by now, because we've seen the same ad revenue decreases that all of these shows are experiencing. So all I can really say is to everyone who is currently a member, this is not like a catchphrase anymore. We only exist because of your membership. I mean, straight up, that's just the way it is. And we do need to keep growing that membership base, because my prediction is ad revenue is going to continue declining over time. That's my sense. And the more we rely on you, the stronger the support from our viewers is, the better we're going to do. And along those lines, we have this great membership special going on right now, davidpakman.com/summertime14. If you go to davidpakman.com/summertime14, we will send you a free t-shirt as well as a free bumper sticker with your yearly membership. And if there's any better story around why we really do need your support, and your support is crucial, it's the number of progressive radio shows that are one by one going off the air. Let's take a break. Next is Philippe Assouline. We will talk to him after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Philippe Assouline, who's a political writer, activist, lawyer, and currently pursuing a PhD in international relations and political psychology at UCLA. He's been heavily involved in combating extremist anti-Israel propaganda on campuses for a number of years, including at UCLA. He writes and teaches on the subject. Philippe, it's really a pleasure to have you. And I already am nervous to have you, because the issue of Israel and Palestine, for me, as a secular progressive Jew who supports Israel's right to exist, and I find it crazy I even have to say that sometimes. It's a topic that whenever I bring it up, it is a firestorm from both the left and the right on the American political spectrum. And I know that you've tackled a lot of these issues. We recently have had a study from the ADL showing that 1 in 4 adults surveyed around the world hold relatively significant anti-Semitic beliefs. So I want to start as broadly as possible with you. Why do you believe that in the United States, it has become the kind of default litmus test for progressives to be very strongly anti-Israel in a way that seems to not match views on other countries with similar pasts and political situations?
So thanks for having me, David, and thank you for your question. I hope we haven't crossed the Rubicon where, as you're saying, it's a litmus test now for being for liberal credentials. Unfortunately, it's been made into a wedge issue, and the politics in this country, my assessment is that there's a lot too much gang mentality, if I can put it that way, where people are more concerned about defining themselves in opposition to the other side than looking at the issues, especially when they don't have a direct stake in them. And the campaign of demonizing Israel exploits that. And there's a very active, targeted, I think, very well-funded campaign that exploits natural feelings of compassion, the natural inclinations of liberal voters, which are more towards concern for minorities, for example, and it exploits that through imagery that already exists in the American conscience, in the American political repertoire. Instead of informing people about Israel, this campaign puts Israel into the categories that, in particular, liberals don't question. And it has a tremendous effect because if you're not conscious of what's going on, having your emotions triggered and manipulated that way is a very powerful thing. It's actually part of what I study in political psychology. And people are turned against Israel for the right reasons, but based on largely, if not overwhelmingly, lies.
And I've experienced this quite a bit being in New York City. I've decided, there's no shortage of events related to Judaism and Israel to check out here. And I find that there seems to be a lack of connection to reality on both sides. Without naming any names, I've gone to some events that will bring in a speaker on the topic of Israel, and it will be the most extreme, pro-Israel, militant, conservative, reactionary point of view. And I absolutely don't fit there. It very often takes on an anti-Muslim mentality. It often takes on an Israel can do no wrong mentality. That's not the right place for me. At the same time, I've attended other types of events here that claim to have more of a balanced view on Israel, and they are militantly anti-Israel. They ignore the incredible double standard around the BDS movement, for example, the double standard around, we talk about the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip, but not the Egyptian one, which exists for the same reasons. Is there no real middle ground in the U.S.?
You may not like my answer. I've been discussing this exact topic for a while, and thank you for bringing it up. I don't see enough of a middle ground. I don't see, unless people have some kind of direct stake or they know somebody there, they've been forced to actually do some homework, which is not a given. People don't have the time or the bandwidth to go actually look at these things in depth. But absolutely, I see a lack of any thought-out discourse on this if I'm talking in the mainstream. And I agree with you that the conservative side, there are way too many people who confuse being anti-Islamic for being Zionist, or being uncompromising and rigid, or an armchair Rambo for being a Zionist. And I deplore that, because Zionism, as far as I see it, and I know quite a lot about it, I'm Israeli, I've lived there, is very inclusive in the sense that it's a movement for the liberation of the Jewish people and the establishing of Jewish self-determination, but in no way is it exclusive, exclusionary, racist. On the contrary, it's the movement that gave Arab people democracy, the only movement that gave Arab people democracy in the Middle East. It's become caricatured here as a wedge issue that people define themselves politically by on both sides. On the liberal side, as you know, there's so many false notions going around as accepted wisdom, and it's very, very sad. I think the lack of communication between people of different camps, the lack of contact between the traditional, maybe more right-wing Jewish community establishments and non-Jews has a lot to do with why people are locked into these attitudes or that are a bit cartoonish.
And I think it's fair,
yeah.
it's understandable that if people see the only voices that they see that are supportive of Israel are these extreme American, often Christian right-wing voices, I can understand being very turned off by that and thinking, whoa, if that's what they believe, that can't possibly be right. And so I understand that, but the problem is there doesn't seem to be a progressive, balanced counterpoint. Everything I see on the other side is completely, it's further divisive and ad hominem when it comes to Israel, and it characterizes Israel in a way that no other country with either conflicted territories or similar disputes is held to the same standard, and I can't seem to have a rational conversation with people about it. In fact, I've probably lost some friends over trying to have rational conversations about this. When I say, Philippe, well, listen, you know, if you're so concerned with what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and you claim that anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish sentiment is not a factor, why have I never heard you mention Tibet or Georgia or Syria or Armenia or even Ukraine? There seems to be something that is making people fixate on Israel when there are so many other examples that they could be putting their activism into.
Correct. I don't know if it's as absolute as you're saying that there are no progressive cases being made. I try certainly to do it. The reason I think people have been captivated to the extent you're talking about, and I think your description is quite accurate, in my opinion, is a testament to the power of propaganda. There is a tendency inherent in leftist progressive movements to try to help the underdog. And there's been a very conscious effort to frame Palestinians as victims, as perfect victims, no matter what the context is. Now, I find this quite racist to actually deprive the Palestinians of accountability, to treat them like they're never responsible for the choices of their leaders. But this seems to be the current understanding of the situation on the left, that Palestinians writ large are victims. No matter what happened, they're victims. This allows a lot of people on the left who don't want to think too hard about the issues to feel benevolent, feel progressive without really getting into the substance. And I think it's just as egregious a mistake as people on the right that I just described who use this as an excuse to, pour their resentment of Muslims or Islam. It's a bit of a cartoonish understanding, and I think ultimately the solution will be if Israel starts to tell its story in an effective and emotionally compelling way as well. Not dishonest, of course, but emotionally compelling. The Israeli side is not doing that. It's bombarding people with dry facts or almost guilt, which is not going to work on people on the progressive left. And for people on the right, that's not what they need. They need to be exposed to an Israel that is based in reality, not their fantasy of exclusionary and angry state that you so often hear described.
I often also find that when I issue a criticism of the United States, be it a conservative or liberal a politician or whatever the case may be, never does the conversation go to, let's question whether the country should even exist. Let's go back to how the country was created. Now, when I, as a progressive supporter of Israel, point out, for example, that I think it's very dishonest and a terrible policy and really just something that should stop when we see these examples of artifacts, so-called Jewish artifacts, being found and really sometimes planted in the contested territories. Immediately there is kind of an archaeological dig created around these artifacts, and this can expand into something that is a settlement. I am against that, right? I've been very clear that I am against that. But immediately when I concede that, I receive a barrage of criticism saying, see, David, don't you see that Israel should not exist? And with no other country have I ever seen that standard applied, that when we identify a policy that we disagree with, we jump to questioning the country's existence at the very beginning.
Correct. Israel's been put on probation. Now, just a little note: I haven't heard of artifacts being planted, but as you're saying, you can have a nuanced view of the settlement issue without putting Israel's existence on probation. No other country on earth, I think, in history is constantly being undermined. Its right to exist is constantly being undermined based on what allegedly it did at its founding. Part of the responsibility is with defenders of Israel on that. We tend to be, from what I'm seeing, at least in my experience on campuses, which is quite extensive, we tend to be apologetic way too much. There is a lot of importance to place on the messenger and the confidence with which we speak. And I think we have a very strong case, in particular from the progressive angle, from the leftist angle, from the democratic angle. And yet we find ourselves apologizing way too much. And the message is, right, Israel should be on probation. Yes, if Israel doesn't act perfectly, then it doesn't have a right to exist. Which, as you know, as somebody who's informed, is a bit insane. If you look at the Middle East now, and even in the last 65 years, and your reaction is to point to Israel in criticizing human rights or any kind of political progress metric, there's a problem right there, right? That's a lack of fairness. But again, I think we encourage it by being a bit too apologetic.
We've been speaking with Philippe Assouline. There are two other things I want to talk to you about, Philippe, but we just don't have time today. One is the BDS movement more specifically, and then further I want to talk about the concept of a religious Jewish state versus a secular Jewish state. So we'll definitely have you back to talk about those things, and I really do appreciate you being on.
Thank you. I appreciate being on, and those are crucial questions. I'd be very happy to talk about them.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Last week we told you about how Joe the plumber, actually Samuel Wurzelbacher, the unlicensed plumber, wrote this letter after the UCSB drive-by shooting tragedy where he told the parents of the victims of that shooting that their dead kids don't trump his constitutional rights to own a gun. He claims that he wrote that letter the day before Memorial Day to stand up for veterans, and then he further used veterans to inflict pain upon the parents of the UCSB shooting victims. He said, why are the lives of the brave Americans that we're supposed to be honoring on Memorial Day less important than the victims of Elliot Rodger? Because if the solution to this horrible incident is surrendering to the devious schemes of oppression, it nullifies the service of all veterans. To infringe on our rights to bear arms would make a mockery of our fallen heroes who died defending our way of life. So what he's kind of saying is that if we prevent everybody from having unlimited guns all the time in order to prevent shootings, that apparently, Lewis, is an insult to those who served and died. Okay, the logic doesn't really make sense, but there's more to it, so let's continue. He also seems to believe that the guns themselves can be used for killing politicians. He went on this following rant. Left-leaning politicians and their lapdogs in the mainstream media want to use this crisis, talking about the UCSB crisis, to further chip away at our rights. They want to use these deaths to gain more power and more control. They only care about the victims so long as they serve a purpose. And then he said that those guns are for shooting politicians. Guns are mostly for hunting down politicians who would actively seek to take your freedoms and liberty away from you. Google Hitler, Mao, Kim Jong-il, Castro, Stalin, just for starters. Okay. The fact that there are people like Joe the plumber out there who advocate the usage of guns to kill elected officials is actually part of the reason we need stricter gun safety laws. Joe the plumber, in this unhinged rant about his rights, dead kids, and shooting politicians, is actually proving, Lewis, why we need stricter gun safety laws in this country, because people like him are around there.
Yeah, I really hope nobody's listening to this guy. I'm just starting to think that this is someone who loves the sound of his own voice and is just trying to get attention.
Yeah.
But still, a lot of people seem to like him.
Well, I don't understand why we haven't seen him completely denounced at this point, right? I mean, where are the Republicans who are going to say, yeah, we don't stand by anything he says. We actually want him to no longer speak on any issues. He has absolutely no affiliation with any of us. What he says is completely deplorable. And further, using military veterans, right? Supposedly the American right supports our troops. They value our troop service, et cetera, ad nauseum, which we hear them say, but it doesn't really seem like they actually act on much of this. And now he says our armed forces fight for our freedoms, but they fight so that we don't lose our guns because we're trying to prevent insane shooting sprees from happening. I mean, it's just such twisted logic. And this guy, like Lewis said, is still a hero to many conservatives. And I'm just waiting, Lewis, for someone to denounce him on the right and say, he's out. He's out of our umbrella. We're the big tent party, supposedly. It's not quite big enough for Joe the plumber.
That would be nice, but right, I'm sick of him speaking for vets. I'm sick of all sorts of people who aren't veterans speaking for them. Perhaps we should just hear from the veterans and get rid of guys like Sam Wurzelbacher.
Samuel Joe the plumber Wurzelbacher, the non-plumber who lied about the business he was going to buy. Yeah, being ignored at work might be even worse than being bullied, according to a new study from the University of British Columbia's Sauder School of Business. This is really interesting. Researchers consider that while most say ostracism is not as harmful as bullying, that feeling excluded is actually far more likely to lead to job dissatisfaction, quitting your job, as well as health problems. Sauder professor Sandra Robinson says, we've been taught that ignoring someone is socially preferable. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. But ostracism usually leads people to feel more helpless, like they're not even worthy of attention at all. I find this really, really interesting because I'm not so interested with the work component, but I am interested with the school bullying aspect of it. And I wonder, when you are being bullied, you can respond to the bullying, right? Many people don't feel able to. They become socially paralyzed, physically fearful, mentally beaten down, and otherwise, for other perfectly valid reasons, they're not really in any state to respond to the bullying. But there is something to respond to, right? And being completely ignored, ostracized, or kind of outcast in whatever micro society we're talking about, your workplace or your school, you can't really respond to just being ignored. And maybe there's something about that, Lewis, that is connected with the results of this study.
Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't really know what how extensive this study was, but it's interesting. I mean, personally, if we're talking about the workplace, I kind of like being ignored at work.
You do like it, but in what sense? In other words, because of what?
Well, I guess if people are ignoring you for a certain reason, it might change things. But if if you don't want to be bothered and people know you don't want to be bothered and they just kind of don't want to talk to you because they think you're abrasive, I don't know, that seems fine with me.
All right. Well, Lewis seems to have kind of teed up a very specific situation for us. But needless to say, the study says the negative effects of being ignored, at least in the workplace, we don't know how this would apply in schools with younger people, are far more damaging than those of actually being bullied, either physically or verbally. Send me your thoughts on this. I know that we will have people in our audience that will want to weigh in on this. What do you think? Is there something that the study is missing that would be key to our understanding of this dynamic? Let's go to your voicemails. 219-2DavidP is our voicemail number. Here is one voicemail. Let's listen to this.
Hey, David Backman. It's Brian, the bumper sticker guy from Knoxville. I was listening to Sean Hannity today. It's Thursday, May 22nd, and he went on and on about how great it is that he gave out some guys website information for jobs. And so many people went to the website, it crashed, that they crashed the servers. And he was gloating about it, about how amazing it is.
Yeah.
And the double standard that exists, where when Sean Hannity crashes a website because of the demand he puts to it, and how it's a horrible thing. And, it's all built by the government meant to fail.
This is a brilliant observation. When Hannity refers people to a website, and so many people go that the website crashes, that's a huge success. When so many people go to healthcare.gov because they want healthcare that the website crashes or is slow, all of a sudden Obama's evil and we need to repeal the Affordable Care Act, when it's the exact same logic. So many people want what is being offered that it brings down the website. Excellent, excellent voicemail. Let's listen to one more here.
Hey guys, I wanted to call about the March Against Monsanto video. On one hand, David, I'm really glad to hear you not knocking, that you aren't knocking GMOs, because they get a really bad rap unfairly. In fact, you're one of the few people who do that, but I think a few times now I've heard you bring up this point about the seeds that, are blown onto farmers' property. And I just, I really would advise to look that up. That and several other, what are actually rumors that are being spread about Monsanto. It's actually, like, this is a case of a story that is completely being taken out of context and kind of blown to more or less a lie.
Yeah. After receiving this email, I did dig into it more. And for all of the things that we can criticize Monsanto for legitimately, the story of the seeds blowing and into an adjacent field and then suing that farmer, those don't appear to be true. So I stand corrected, and thank you for keeping us on track there. That's absolutely seems to be accurate based on the follow-up research that I've done. On today's bonus show, solar roads. This is blowing up. If you haven't seen the video, you must have been avoiding the internet for a couple weeks. We will talk about the candle craze. We will also talk about regrowing teeth with lasers. davidpakman.com/membership. But for the next few days, get yourself a free t-shirt as well as a free bumper sticker by going to davidpakman.com/summertime14.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.